Steamer Joe, ready for the second part of the Sirius assembly. I'll install the crankshaft. I'm anxious to make sure everything is absolutely as clean as possible. The journals, bronze journals, are very, very close fit on the crank, and I've already discovered during the assembly when I was test running on air that even a tiny little chip between the mating surface on the block and the journal faces will cause binding in the assembly. So, well, I've got this here. I hope this will show up. I mentioned before that the designers of this engine made provisions for oiling. I mean, this is a high-speed engine. It has a wet sump, of course. And so these journals were designed up here at the top as it fits into the block is an oil hole, chamfered oil hole. It feeds down into this groove to distribute the oil along the length of the shaft. And then at the outboard end, there's an annular groove machined into it. And on the bottom of the engine, there's a drain hole. I hope you can see that right there. There's a little hole, 16th inch hole, drained in or drilled into that annular groove, and that hole exits here and drains oil back into the crankcase. The same way with the flywheel end bearing. But I do want to make sure these are clean as I put them in there. I want to make sure that the gasket as well has no chips or anything on it. I've soaked these gaskets in 20 weight oil, and they seem to seal perfectly during all the test running. 15 thousandths thick paper gaskets. So the crankshaft has to be installed into the crankcase before the journals are mounted. The holes in the end of the crankcase are, you have to kind of manipulate the crank in there because the crank webs are actually larger than the holes in the case. This end has two oil holes, and then the same arrangements with a groove and an annular groove on the outside for the oil to drain. crank itself has been bagged up since I quit test running. I want to make sure it too has no dirt or anything on it. I actually allowed almost a full thousandth of an inch clearance on the journals. They get oiled very well, and I sure didn't want to have any binding on those when it gets hot, because that bronze doesn't expand at the same rate as the steel, so they could very well, even now, I'll have to watch it and see when it gets hot. They may cause some binding on the crank. But while I've got this, the design of the engine, the drawing, calls for taper pins to be used to hold the gears in place. There's a driving gear on the crank and then a gear on the eccentric shaft. So the kit of materials provided these two taper pins, slightly different sizes for the two different gears. But I was so unsure. They give a diagram to show the valve timing, and I followed that carefully. But I assembled it without the pins and without any modifications to the shaft, and used set screws. Well, I did need to do some adjustment initially to get the timing exactly right, and when I did, I screwed down tight on the set screws to mark the shafts. It made the gears a little difficult to remove, but this one's just on a little short section at near this crank web of diameter that fits the gear, and the same thing on the eccentric shaft. There's just a short section that the gear mounts to. So it made it a little difficult to get the shafts off, but it was marked well, so I could take it to the mill and mill a flat in that position. So I don't know. I may pin those eventually, but once I got the gear on the shaft located well, I put some high strength Loctite on that set screw, which screws down onto a flat similar to this on the crank, and I don't believe it'll ever come loose, so I may not use the taper pins. But at any rate, crank mounted in there. Of course, there's a flat milled on the bottom side of these journals, just to correspond with the crankcase. There's actually a little bit of clearance there to keep those from binding. The kit of materials with the engine also provides all of the fasteners you need to complete the engine, but they're all British Association threads, which I've used on many of the other Stuart engines I've built, but you know, taps and dies are tough to come by, and they were all cheese head machine screws, which over time it's hard to really torque them down where they should be, and the slots get messed up, and they look traditional, but I got some model engineering fasteners, have a slightly larger head than a standard these are 632 bolts, stainless steel bolts. I think I mentioned before how I hate rust. So I'm going to oil this up good before I slide it in there. I left that cap loose so I could kind of move this crank around. But once these bolts are tight, the crank won't slide out of the crankcase. So, but I want to get some oil on there. I just put 30 weight non-detergent motor oil. It's actually, well, I think I started with 10 weight oil during the run-in early on, just to make sure it'd find its way up into all the bearings easily. And then I switched to 30 weight. I don't know. I'm not sure what oil is recommended. I built the Little Sun engine, and I had read about, but discovered it's certainly true that the oil, that engine didn't use rings. And I think it just had bronze pistons. Anyway, I know even on the Sirius there is an issue with water blowing by the pistons and condensing in the crankcase and turning the oil into kind of a paste. So, but I'm not really sure what oil is recommended for the crankcase. I wish if anybody out there knows what the best oil to use in the crankcase is, I wish you'd leave a comment. Let me know. I'm a little concerned about it. I don't want to use detergent-based oil, because anything that comes out of this I want to just settle to the bottom of the sump. But, you know, it's going to get pretty hot, and the straight 30 weight oil will thin out at higher temperatures. So if I don't hear any different or learn any different before I run it on steam, I'll probably fill the sump with 30 weight non-detergent oil. Look at that. I'm frankly amazed myself at how free this crank is. Although I went to great lengths to try and assure perpendicularity and straightness and smoothness of all the assemblies. I went to great lengths. And, you know, it is, what size are those? I think they're 7/32. Well, I'm thinking now, as I'm tightening these up, the block was completely oil-free. I washed it in naphtha and in lacquer thinner before I painted it. I've got to get some oil on the cylinders before they flash rust. Probably do that right now as I finish this up. But would have been a perfect opportunity to Loctite these bolts in there. But I'll just have to check after a little bit of running once I get it good and hot. Make sure they're still good and tight in there. They've got quite a length of engagement in the cast iron, so it should be fine. I'm just going to rub a little bit of oil in those cylinders. Just 30 weight oil again, just to keep them from rusting until I get the rest of the assembly complete. Looks like I've got a little bit of paint that got up onto the edges of the head. I don't want that. The only reason I just painted these yesterday with Rust-Oleum spray paint, and I'm sure you guys have used that paint and understand that it takes forever to dry. It can be for days and days after it's painted. It can stay soft enough that you can make a mark in it with your fingernail. So I took these parts and baked them in the oven as low as, my oven only goes as low as 170 degrees, but I baked them at 170 degrees for 3 hours, and it came out hard. So, oh, I want to get some oil in here too. Probably run one of those plugs back in there and get that distributed. I noticed while I was what had I done? Oh, after I lapped them, the cylinders, I cleaned the what the hell? Oh, that's my pipe threaded sump plug. But after I lapped those cylinders, I washed it thoroughly with solvent and with hot soapy water to make sure I got all of that lapping compound out of the cylinders. And then I just left it on the bench till the following day. Well, in that amount of time, I had flash rust. Almost everywhere there was bright cast. I mean, it just rubbed off with some oil, but that's why I'm taking all this time to get everything oiled. So, well, crankshaft installed, running freely. I'll continue on with the assembly in the next part.